Hey everyone, I'm going to give you an update now. So about 3 or 3.5 hours ago, Moderna has released a statement along with a little bit of data from their phase 3 trial results on their COVID vaccine. And up front, I want to state that this video is going to play off of the previous video that I did in regards to the Pfizer vaccine. So if you haven't seen that, go back and watch that because a lot of the things I'm going to say in that video are applicable to this video, and it might help explain some of the things that I kind of gloss over in this one because I spent more time talking about it last time. Also of note, before we get into this, Moderna has provided a lot more information in this statement than Pfizer did in their statement that they made last week when I made the previous video. So when I'm making statements in this video, I have a little bit more to work on than last time. Last time, all we had was a number, basically, in terms of the Pfizer vaccine being 90% effective. That was almost all that we had, and there was no data released. We still don't have formal data released from that phase 3 trial. This one, we don't have the formal data released, but we have a little bit more to work off of. So without further ado, let's get into it. Moderna made this announcement about 3.5 hours ago now, that their vaccine candidate, which is an mRNA vaccine candidate, just like Pfizer's vaccine, is 94.5% effective. What does this mean? Again, just like with the Pfizer vaccine, what it meant is that in their phase 3 trial plan, they were going to have 30,000 people in the phase 3 trials. Pfizer had 44,000, Moderna uses 30,000. 15,000 people were vaccinated with their vaccine candidate, 15,000 people were given a placebo, so basically they were just given some saline water in their arm. Then they were going to follow these people and see how many of them developed COVID, as well as how many of them were severe cases, etc., etc. There's a bunch of different things that they could measure, but that was roughly the study design. And like Pfizer, they had a plan to release some data when they got to the 94 case mark. So between the two groups, vaccinated and unvaccinated, once they got to 94 combined cases, they would release some data. That's the first data drop, and then they would release data later. Moderna had agreed on releasing it at the 151 case mark. Pfizer was at the 164 case mark. But regardless, the idea was the same. They were going to release data as it came and basically at increments. So today, they just made their announcement that they got to the 94 case mark. And in fact, they got to 95. So what does this 94.5% efficacy mean? It means that of the 95 people, 90 of them were in the unvaccinated group, only 5 of them were in the vaccinated group. So again, there was 15,000 people in each group. In the unvaccinated group, 90 so far have tested positive for COVID, and I believe symptomatic COVID. In the vaccinated group, only 5 people have tested positive. The other important thing here is that out of the 95 people, there was 11 severe cases, and all 11 severe cases were in the unvaccinated group. This is important because, of course, you want to not only decrease the amount of people that are getting sick, but you want to also decrease severity. So, of course, it's important to understand that there was only 5 cases of people in the vaccinated group. So the fact that there was not a severe case within that group of 5 doesn't mean that you could not have a severe case of COVID in someone who is vaccinated with the Moderna vaccine. It just means that they didn't see it out of these 5 people. But it's still encouraging that out of the 11 severe cases, out of the 95 cases overall, all of them were in the unvaccinated group. None of them were in the vaccinated group. That's good news. Even better news is the transportation, supply chain side of things. So you may have remembered that from the Pfizer video, I mentioned that their vaccine has to be transported and stored at minus 80 Celsius. And this is a bit of a logistics problem because in most places, minus 80 Celsius is really hard to achieve, and there's not that many places really that have that kind of capacity, especially for storing large amounts of vaccine. My town, for example, we might have one minus 80 freezer in the entire town, in the entire county, in fact. So in a lot of rural places, in developing places, you might not have the capacity at all to store things at minus 80. So there's a little bit of a supply chain issue with the Pfizer vaccine, which had to be stored at minus 80 again. Moderna's vaccine, on the other hand, it's because of the lipid that the mRNA is housed in. We'll get to that in just a second. The Moderna vaccine only has to be stored at minus 20 Celsius, which is, still really cold. And again, not everywhere in the world is going to be able to store things at minus 20 Celsius, but a lot more have the capacity for storing things at minus 20 Celsius and then minus 80 Celsius. Even more encouraging is that originally, Moderna had thought that at refrigerator temperatures, so like 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, 2 to 8 degrees Celsius, at refrigerator temperatures, they thought that their vaccine would only last for 7 days. Turns out now that it's actually closer to 30 days. That's huge. Being able to get a 30-day supply in the refrigerator is massive. So this is highly encouraging that this vaccine candidate would be able to be stored almost anywhere. Most places have the ability to at least refrigerate vaccines. And so being able to have 30-day supplies being refrigerated and then distributed over the course of that 30 days really expands the number of places that can be administering the vaccine almost limitlessly, much more so than having something that has to be stored at minus 80 or even minus 20 for the entire duration of its storage. There's a few other things that we should understand before I wrap this video up. So again, this is an mRNA vaccine, same as the Pfizer vaccine. What does that mean? Okay, I'm going to run through it briefly because we've talked about it before. Feel free to check out my previous, I believe I talked about it a little bit in the Pfizer vaccine video. If not, I have more in my Patreon about vaccine types and whatnot. So what does an mRNA vaccine do? How does it work? Okay, mRNA, this is important to understand. mRNA is basically a string of nucleotides, so it's just a genetic code with a phosphosugar backbone. That's not that important, but the point is it's a code. And that code gets translated into proteins. So the specific set of letters gets read, basically. This is an oversimplification, but for our purposes, it's fine. That code gets read and translated into proteins. So if you engineer a code that you know what the code is coding for, you can make a code that translates into certain proteins. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. If not, feel free to let me know. What they've done is they've synthetically made mRNA that codes for the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2, which is the causative virus for COVID. And again, if you don't remember, the spike protein is on the surface of SARS-CoV-2 and it's responsible for docking and entry into the host cell. So what they've done is they've taken mRNA that codes for the spike protein. They've put it into a fat capsule, a lipid capsule, fat capsule. You inject it into the person. The mRNA gets into the person's cell, and that cell then, the human cell, begins producing the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2 because that mRNA is being translated. So now you have the spike protein in your body without ever having to have had the virus in your body. What does this mean? It means that your body then is able to recognize and respond to, have an immunological response to the spike protein. And the idea here is that you would develop memory against the spike protein without ever having to have had the virus itself in your system. That means that your body would recognize the spike protein, and so if you were ever infected with the virus itself, your body would say, I recognize that, that's the spike protein, and it's able to respond right away and basically either prevent you from being sick or wiping it out almost immediately. That's huge. You never have to have the virus inside your body in order to develop memory. This is a very safe vaccine strategy in terms of how the vaccine is planned. We've never actually had an mRNA vaccine that's been approved for human usage before, but the risk of side effects is quite low just because it is only mRNA. There is no active agent going into the body. So let's recap. 94.5% effective means that out of these 95 people that got infected, only 5 of them were in the vaccinated group. That's a very small sample size out of the 30,000 people, but again, this is just the first release of data. 2, supply chain. Can be stored at minus 20 for long times, and it can remain up to 30 days in refrigerated temperatures, which means that it can go many more places than the Pfizer vaccine, which has to remain at -80. Now, how many are going to be available? This is the other critical point. So if you remember, in my last video, we said Pfizer had announced that they planned on having 50 million doses by the end of the year and up to 1.3 billion doses by the end of 2021. Both the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine require 2 shots in order for it to be effective, an initial shot and a booster. It's 3 weeks apart for the Pfizer vaccine, it's 4 weeks apart for the Moderna vaccine. So, in Pfizer's case, 50 million doses by the end of the year mean that 25 million people would be able to be vaccinated. 1.3 billion doses by the end of next year means 650 million people would be able to be vaccinated. Moderna. Now, Moderna, when they give their estimates, let's just be careful with our estimates here because Moderna has never actually made a vaccine before, never has mass-produced a vaccine for human usage. And so when they give their projections, they're basing this off of what they think, but they don't actually have the experience in doing so. So these estimates might be a little bit more off than we might see from other pharmaceutical companies that do make vaccines all the time and therefore know how long that process is generally going to take them, what kind of hiccups they're going to run into, etc., etc. So just that slight caveat in Moderna's estimation, though I would project it to be relatively accurate. I just wanted to get that caveat out there. So Moderna projects that by the end of the year, they will have 20 million doses, and by the end of 2021, they'll have produced between 500 million and 1 billion. Again, it's a 2-dose vaccine, so 20 million by the end of this year means that 10 million people would be able to be vaccinated with the Moderna vaccine, and by the end of next year, between 250 million and 500 million people will be able to be vaccinated. So between the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine, if all goes according to plan, by the end of this year, let's just see, 35 million people would be able to be vaccinated between those 2 vaccines, and by the end of next year, somewhere between, doing math in my head, 900 million and 1.15 billion people would be able to be vaccinated with those 2 vaccines. So that's a lot of people. It's not everyone. And we know that in order for a herd immunity to take place, we have to get to at least 60% of the people being immune at a given time to COVID in order for the immunity that's natural within the population to push down the amount of transmission. So again, what did I say? 1.15 billion people would be able to be vaccinated by the end of 2021 between those 2 vaccines. That's roughly a 1/7 of the world's population. So we need to get to about 5/7, 4/7, 5/7, somewhere between there. Probably closer to 4/7, but between 4 and 5/7 of the world's population. We're at 1/7. We don't know how many people are going to be infected by 2021, but unless we get almost half of the world's population infected, something like 40% of the world's population infected by the end of 2021, we're going to require either more cooperation between other pharmaceutical companies in licensing the vaccine from those companies in order to produce them and ramp up production more, or we're going to need more vaccines being approved within the next year. So, when can you expect it? They're going to be releasing more data again when they get Moderna went to the 151 case mark, Pfizer to the 164 case mark. At that point, they'll apply for an emergency use authorization. And at that point, they'll be able to, if it's authorized, begin giving it to people. By the end of December, hopefully, we'll be administering vaccines to people on the front lines. Most people will probably not be getting a vaccine. It'll not be available for most people until at least April or May of next year. And then it'll start to be available to the public. Last thing I'm going to say, because I'm just about out of time, is that we don't know what the long-term efficacy is. So these have only been administered for a couple of months, and we're seeing 90% in Pfizer, 94.5% in Moderna. We don't know what it's going to be in the months after that. We don't know how quickly it's going to wane because these are new. But that's it for now. Hopefully this update was enlightening. Feel free to share with friends, and I'll get back to you when there's more information available. Take care.